So welcome everyone. I'm here with Guillaume Raille, co-founder of SubstantAI and the original authors of the open source project MCPAdapt, and also contributor to many open source projects such as HuggingFace's SmallAgents and Crew AI and Anthropic's Python SDK. Guillaume, welcome to the course.
Hi Zoltan, thank you. Pleasure for being here.
Let's just start with a few personal questions and questions about your professional past. So can you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your company?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Guillaume. I'm a data scientist by training. I worked for the past 5 years developing solutions in data science and data engineering for banks and insurance in Switzerland. And I also have a small background in NLP research. I did a bit of a thesis around transformers when it just came out around 2017. I'm also, so as you mentioned, the CTO and co-founder of SubstantAI, where we help consultants manage their business relationships. Otherwise, so yes, I've been active around the MCP protocol to develop like open source solution since the very beginning in November 2024. And I created MCPAdapt, which I hope we will have a bit more time to talk about in this interview.
Yeah, we will, definitely. Yeah, thanks. So you've been on this highway for quite a while. Can you tell us a little bit how your experience with working with LLMs and agents shaped your perspective of the challenges with LLMs and agents?
Yes, so I've been able through this past 5 years, to see a few LLM use cases in production. And one of the most prominent experience I have probably with LLMs in production is this use case I've developed in an insurance company where we worked closely with contracts, so insurance contracts, and the goal was to extract a graph representation of that contract in order to understand, in the case of a claim, if the customer is covered or not covered based on the content of the contract, to quickly make a decision about that. And so like developing this solution, I saw like a lot of like, so the help that LLMs can bring in making this faster process, but at the same time, I also saw like a bit what are the drawbacks and the dangers of having the solution in production, such as the fact that, it's not so completely reliable. It's not like fully deterministic. So like running several times the same evals, for example, will give you different results.
Yeah.
And I think it's really shaped also like the way I'm now developing my startup and SubstantAI with like this philosophy of keeping things really simple and probably also like maybe use agents more as a last resort and focus more on, like AI workflows as much as I can, where like I would more like program the pipeline of what I want to do and then bring AI pieces in the middle of it, who's close to LLM, before resorting to agents that would sort of like magically give an answer to everything. It's a bit following as well, like probably the guidelines from and the post that Anthropics makes about like best use of agents in production that they've seen.
That's a great reference. So I'll ensure that we put this to the course resources, these resources to talk about. So yes, you had quite some experience with these topics. Can you remember what the specific moment or project was when you thought that there has to be a better way to do this and started working on MCPAdapt? So like, what was your aha moment here?
Yeah, so to come back to MCPAdapt a bit like the inception, I think so. At the beginning of MCP, I saw the potential, of like having MCP servers that could be used across different places. And at the same time, I saw something else, right? Which is like the rise of like so many agentic frameworks. You had, like, so of course, HuggingFace SmallAgents, but also Crew AI, also LangChain had one, also LlamaIndex had one. I mean, and today there are so many of those. I was like seeing that each of them implemented in a different way the tools and the tool use that was a bit similar to what MCP server were providing, like, or at least part of it is tools, but it was not immediately compatible. So all of those frameworks that were not supporting MCP. And since they had all their own implementation, I thought, okay, maybe we could do something here. We could have like some sort of adapters that would bring, these tools into this different agentic framework. And that's where I started to work on MCPAdapt. Actually, it was not a very long work. I just spent the weekend on it. And releasing it on Reddit, I saw like the community was very happy to see this project and to see that they could use now MCP servers, because there was already like hundreds of MCP servers available out there into their favorite agentic framework, and they were very happy to jump on the project and start to help developing it, but also like putting stars on it, I guess. And that's a little it all started.
Yeah, and as you just said, it became very successful. But before we discuss the successes, just for those of the students who are not familiar with MCPAdapt or didn't check that part of the course where we had hands-on experience with MCPAdapt, can you explain what problem MCPAdapt solves and how, just on the high level?
Yeah, so it's really just it's very similar to what I said, but essentially like so we create adapters that converts the definition of the MCP server tools. So like MCP use JSON to communicate as part of the protocol, and so this JSON coming in and coming out is usually not directly compatible with the particular agent framework. So we work only with Python in MCPAdapt, so it's only like a Pythonic agentic frameworks. But so it's not directly compatible, and also like each agentic framework that define their own tool class, and because they define their own tool class, and also like specificity in how to use them within their framework, you need to sort of like adapt a bit where hence the name MCPAdapt, I guess. It adapt a bit the MCP tool to work with that framework, and so we make it very easy to create adapters for each of those different frameworks, such that it's seamless for the end user to use MCP tools for the given for any given agentic framework.
Yeah, makes sense. And it seems that it was a good idea, because MCPAdapt gained traction incredibly quickly, and you have many contributors. Why do you think it resonated so quickly and so strongly right after release?
So I think so a few things, right? Like I think it brought really some things to the community that didn't exist before. So like people were very happy, for example, to start using it with I don't know, like LangChain or with SmallAgents, where before they could not even use MCP. So there was this gap a bit between the agentic framework capabilities and all the tools, the hundreds of tools available on GitHub. So people were very happy to just be able to use MCP. I guess that brings a bit of interest. But also like sorry, I lost a bit track of the question.
Yeah, the question was that like why do you think it became so successful? But you were actually answering the question. So you said that people were very happy that there were like already a bunch of tools and offerings out there, and it needed a bridge, if I understand correctly, to plug them into these agent frameworks.
Yes, and also like maybe some other points on this. So like what made it also very successful is of course the integration into the various agentic framework that got integrated to, like SmallAgents and AI. So this really brought a lot of people, having, for example, small issues with MCPAdapt or with MCP in general, that would start to post issues on the original agentic framework, but then they realized actually the implementation is done through MCPAdapt, so they would come to MCPAdapt as well, either to help directly with proposals, or also so that also brings a lot of popularity as well as a framework. Yes, and of course, I mean, the general MCP sort of like hype and general media exposure brought also a lot of attention to this project as well.
Yeah, and then the HuggingFace SmallAgents collaboration went it even that far that now in SmallAgents, MCPAdapt is the official way to use MCP tools, which is a massive validation. Just as an inspiration for everyone who is considering to set up an open source project, can you share a little bit about how did that partnership come about, what HuggingFace wanted to build, if they wanted to build your own, and how you convinced them, if they needed to be convinced, that MCPAdapt is the right approach to go?
Yes, so again, so MCPAdapt is really about the fact that there was no support for MCP inside of agentic frameworks. So like I looked around like of the different implementation that were there, of the different agentic frameworks that were available, and then I saw that HuggingFace SmallAgents seems to be seemed to be quite a popular framework. I mean, it was getting traction at the time, maybe 5,000 or maybe a bit more stars. And it didn't support MCP. So I created an issue there. I asked, what about adding support for MCP? I thought actually there was already maybe an existing issue about needing MCP there. And so then I commented, I'm building this solution, MCPAdapt. We have some code that already works with SmallAgents outside of the framework. I would be very, very happy to contribute to make it work directly within the framework. And so we started to discuss with Emeric Roucher, the core maintainer of HuggingFace SmallAgents on this particular issue, on how we could implement that and how we could integrate it inside of the framework. And then, yes, it simply went as a simple question, like, would it be okay to have it as an extra dependency? So, add MCPAdapt as a dependency to SmallAgents. And the answer was just, yes, no problem for him. Because, I mean, you have to think as well that for them, it's quite good because it's just a very low effort for them to integrate MCP, because I was there, I would do all the work. They would just have to review, make sure that I'm not doing something too bad, and they would just merge it. So yeah, it went quite smoothly actually.
Oh, nice. Yeah, but it still requires some trust, right? That what you're pushing in or what they're merging is that legit code. So
also, so they reviewed for sure.
Yeah.
They reviewed. Maybe add some tests as well. I mean, usual open source collaborations.
Nice. That's yeah, that's very great. That's very, very inspiring. So let's just go down to the nasty details. So as you worked and implemented and worked with MCPAdapt or integrated it into HuggingFace, what would you say was the nastiest incompatibility you've had to solve between MCP servers and agent frameworks? For example, what assumption do these frameworks make that just don't work with the reality of MCP servers?
I think the most difficult part, and maybe like where we spent a bit more time to work on MCPAdapt, is the fact that some of the agentic frameworks, they don't support the async API of Python, the async IO API. And this and on the other side, the Python SDK of Anthropic, the MCP official Python SDK, only support async. So we had to juggle around a bit these limitations and make sure that still working seamlessly in a sync environment, we could make the async calls separately and make sure that MCP works even in this sync environment. Some other, I think, complexity we've seen, but it's smaller issues. So all of the things that are about making sure the input and the input outputs match between the JSON MCP representation and then the tools in Python. I would say it's lesser of a challenge, but still something that needs to be done on a case-by-case basis for each of the agents. And there, so one of the issue we've seen as well is, for example, agentic framework not supporting the full JSON specification implementation. So there was some issue with JSON references, for example, which is something where you can reference different parts of your JSON within the same JSON. So this we had also some smaller issues, I would say, but still something to resolve for all of the different frameworks.
So you have resolved quite a few issues when agent frameworks want to work with MCPs, but also today, now MCP support is more widely adopted. What would you say, what makes MCPAdapt different? So if I consider using MCPAdapt, then obviously on one hand, it might add an extra layer of complexity on the top of my code, but it also solves a bunch of incompatibility issues and problems that you just discussed. So why would someone choose MCPAdapt, or when would someone choose MCPAdapt over, for example, LangChain's MCP integration, or just going natively through the LLM's API?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, and I think today more and more the answer is probably go directly through the agentic framework if you can. One of the advantage of MCPAdapt, I believe, is that you can quickly, so using the same MCP code, quickly go through many different agentic implementations. So for example, if you want to compare the performance of your MCP server with many different agentic frameworks, you can do that quite simply. and establish, for example, some sort of benchmark. Because there are some differences, like if you look at small agents, for example, one of the favorite way to use small agent is with this, what they call this code agent, which is actually writing Python and then running it instead of, directly using tool use as it is in the other frameworks. So there are differences that you might want to try with different frameworks, and that's where you can quickly see. But otherwise, I would say it's probably always better to use integrated solutions. MCPAdapt might be the solution in the background that actually makes MCP works for that framework, but as an end user, you might not really be seeing it.
I see. And so now your current venture, SubstantAI, what you do is you build AI-powered Google alerts to keep track of business relationships. And can you share a little bit about how your experience with MCPAdapt helped your company, or how MCPAdapt fits into the whole vision or the product itself?
Yes, at the moment, it's more like in the vision. We did not get to the MCP part of our products. So we are developing the product, but as I was saying a bit at the beginning, like my philosophy right now is to always try to focus on keeping things simple. So I didn't introduce like the agentic part yet, or the MCP part. We have like plans for it, and we want to integrate it. But so far, it's mostly like workflow of AI. So like we have the different steps that we run in the pipeline, and some of them are using LLMs, but it's just LLM calls, and then we get it, and we use mostly like structured output to make sure everything works correctly in production. That being said, so we have plans for MCP. One of the ideas that we are doing with the startup, so like since it's a system similar to Google Alerts, we want to capture the context, the business context of people, and create this memory for them, and expose this memory through MCP. So as an MCP server that would be available for you to bring into the different MCP clients that you want, including a cloud app or the different places to bring the best of your business data and business context there. So that's a bit like where we are. And so MCPAdapt as a solution would probably not be something that we use directly, but definitely an agentic framework around MCP is something that we could use to help, for example, to find the relevant business context based on some queries and things like that. But it's more part of our vision than our execution today.
Okay. So now you mentioned like that you would definitely use an agent, and maybe we can go down to that place where things can go wrong using MCPs. Can you share one integration, either with MCPAdapt or just in general with MCPs, that looked simple on paper but turned into a nightmare? Have you encountered such?
So, I mean, simple on paper and nightmare. I think so. Maybe not really, because MCP really makes it very, very easy. And I think, like, so you have, of course, like the tutorials where everything works and everything is simple. You have then the reality, but I found with MCP, like at least having something working locally is quite simple. Like there is not, and especially if you use, like a fast MCP API that is now integrated in the Python SDK, it makes it quite easy to quickly develop an MCP server. I think why it gets tricky is when you talk about like production usage, production deployments, maybe nowadays a bit if you talk about authentication, which are like newer topics. I think like that's where things becomes really tricky. It was at least very tricky at scale, because like that's also why even the specification of MCP changed. Like having like stateful MCP servers that needs to keep a state about every users for large scale application is very costly, and so providers were really like not happy about that. Started to talk on the MCP protocol GitHub repository, and then they made this change where like there is now this streamable HTTP, which make it possible to have stateless MCP servers as well. So I think that's where it becomes tricky. So like on the deployment part, on the authentication part, having a simple MCP running, I think, is also like still quite simple. Maybe also something that can become difficult over time is managing like a large amount of tools that you have. If your application is quite big, the application you're trying to wrap with MCP is quite big. I think this can also become tricky over time. And that's where like I recommend again, like to start simple So maybe like just a few tools at the beginning, and try to see like if also quite simple even on description of the tools, because it's also an element that is quite key, to make sure that the LLM is using your tools in the right way.
Yeah.
Like really, like as always, I would say in computer science, that simple is sort of like the way to go, probably.
Yeah. It's never simple in production. Okay, last word about MCP Adapt. So where, if you look at your roadmap, what do you see? What's next for MCP Adapt?
Yes, so on the MCPAdapt roadmap, we wanted to integrate a bit like the most recent feature that were developed by the MCP protocol. So like one is the authentication to app. There is a big topic on this. I did a bit of research as well on how we could do that. I think it's something we would be able to bring soon. We've just released the streamable HTTP support. So this one is quite seamless, I would say, and was quite easy to add. So there are a lot of discussion that we had with the various agentic framework on supporting more than just the tools, because at the moment MCPAdapt is just about tools, but you probably know also from the class, right? The MCP protocol is not only about tools, also about resources, sampling and prompts. And so we are having long discussions on the agentic framework side, but also on MCPAdapt, how resources could be used. And there are some, maybe we're going to come back to this in another question, but resources is quite tricky, of a tricky way, because it's not always like very clear how to use them in the end applications or how to leverage them. Yes, so maybe also like finally on MCPAdapt vision, like maybe what the last thing we wanted to do is maybe to convert it more towards like an MCP client, because this is where the direction it's taking in few of the frameworks that we have integrated with. And this is the case for query and SmallAgents. They want something more that looks like an MCP client to them, and not only do best tools, but does also like leverage also the other features of MCP.
Yeah. And this is, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you next, is that also here in the course, students saw that usually we use tools, because tools are like, it's easiest to understand and also probably the most useful. But as you said, the MCP protocol expands beyond tools. So we covered here in the course, at the time of recording, we covered resources and also prompts, and we discussed quickly sampling capabilities. So from your perspective, how important are these features compared to tools, and how well adapted are these?
Yeah, so I think they are great features. Of course, tools is probably like the most prominent at the moment, but it's also like, there is also history to that, because like only a very few amount of clients supports other things than tools. So if you an MCP server developer and like there is only like Cloud desktop app that supports the prompts or only supports the resources, then there is very limited use case where actually your resources would be useful for others, And that's the case if you look MCP implementation, for example, I still think today in VS Code, in Cursor, in many IDE, just support tools. So all of the rest is not going to be used. So that's the first thing, even though, of course, they can be useful. So in terms of importance, I would place tools probably first, because of that. Then, so in terms of the use of the other ones, so like resources, I think can be useful. It's actually used in some of the implementation, I think, around managing, files or context that's too big to fit into the LLM itself. So like if you think about the file, like sometimes you just want to manage the file itself, but you don't want to really like send the content of the file to the LLM. Yeah. If I give you an example, like to reference maybe some part of the file or something like that. So that's where I think resources are useful. But if we come back a bit to like why resources are tricky for MCPAdapt, is because resources, the way they were designed by Anthropic and how it is done today in the Cloud desktop app, if you use resources as an MCP server, what you will get is a list of things to select from as an end user, and then you would put them inside of the context manually. So you would say, my MCP server provide like file A, file B, file C. you as a user can select maybe file A and put it in the prompt, and then the prompt will be able to use file A to answer a question. Right?
Yeah.
Where it's tricky with MCPAdapt is, we don't integrate directly with an end application. So we don't directly integrate with an end user. We work with an agent. So there is like the end user is the agent, and there is MCPAdapt, and the agent integrates and works with MCPAdapt to figure out answers for the user, right? And in this architecture, it's not clear how the agent should be using the resource, right? For example, should we ask the end user to select resources, or should we let the agent make a decision, like on which resources to take by itself? So like this creates some discussions like that we are having, and that's why like at the moment we do not support resources as well, because like there is no clear guidelines on how an agent would actually interact with those resources, and it's not a standard way defined by the protocol. So that's great.
Yeah, so you're saying that, so that's certainly a limitation in Cloud Desktop. I encountered that too, that you need to select resources one by one on the UI. But you gave a good example of like what resources can be useful. Now, what about prompts? Have you, like, we had a kind of some confusion in the course, and I had a hard time explaining why prompts are useful and what's a good use case for prompts. I've been able to find a few, but I would just like to pick your brain about like what were some of the good use cases you encountered when prompts came into play.
So good use cases, I'm not sure really I've seen so far. I know that so MCP protocol was really developed together with the Z editor in mind, the Z ID in mind.
Yeah.
Make it in the course, but so how they use it there, and also like it's a bit like the cursor rules, maybe like there is those list of when cursor rules are more like guidelines for the LLM, I guess, but in Z they really have a prompt library, right? Like where you provide some prompts for your user to be able to perform tasks quicker and not have to redefine the prompt from the beginning.
Yeah.
So I think that's really the idea of prompts. And as an MCP server provider, maybe you have found some ways of working better with your particular tools, or on way that prompting in a different way would make your set of tools works better with the LLM. And they wanted to provide like this opportunity for people on the MCP server side to be able to recommend some way of prompting their MCP server. And so you get the prompt as an end user. And you can even provide like a templated prompt, right? So like you can put values. So the end user would just have to put values, and maybe this would do like something great on its own for the given MCP server. So that's really the point of the prompts.
Thanks. That's a great aspect, and it's very much in line of what we cover here in the course. I'm happy about that. And talking about providers, so if you take a look at your GitHub page, you say that there is a warning which says like, be cautious because there are like 1,000+ MCP servers out there, and you want to ensure that you only use MCP servers that you can trust and they are like production ready. So do you have a guess that if you take like a random sample of 1,000 MCP servers, like what proportion of them is production ready versus only tech demos or just sandbox projects?
Probably, I would say, probably 90% is not production ready, I would say. But also, like, I think the longer you wait, the longer the servers becomes a bit even less reliable, because it's often like, weekend projects or like quick MCP server done on the side. And when that's the case, so like maybe it works like on the same day it's released, but there is like sometimes drifting between for example, the product it's wrapping and the server itself. So like it starts to work less and less over time. Now I would say overall, from what I've seen, probably 90% is not production ready. It doesn't mean you cannot use them, but it means that probably you need to be a bit careful when you just bring something from GitHub. In particular because, and that's also why we had this warning, because it's So in the case of a local MCP server, you're really giving the permission of the MCP server to run a process on your computer, right? So you have to be mindful of that. And it can really like do a lot of harm on your computer if you're not careful. But also like we had a bit of an issue in MCPAdapt at some points that we solved by now, but where we were enabling through the way we wrap the tool to have the SSE MCP server, so like a remote MCP server, executes some code within the MCPAdapt tool. And so we solved that issue right now, but we added that warning at the time because you might not be expecting from a remote MCP server to run some code on your laptop.
Yes, certainly. Yeah.
So we added that warning at the time. I would still be very careful about adding an MCP server without really watching. Like, so there are the official implementation, which are usually great. Like if you look, for example, the GitHub MCP, like so some of those they are really of great quality and maintained, and they have a team behind them, so like it's really great. But also like there are a lot of just single developer MCP server that was just pushed one night, and actually I have some of those, so so I know what I'm talking about. But yes, so like it's just like slowly drifting on GitHub, and are probably not super reliable. Yes.
Okay, so we need to be cautious. Yeah, and we are adding to the statistics because like students of this course are publishing MCP servers and deploying MCP providers by the minute. So
I mean it's great. It's all very great, and they can be used. And I'm not saying you should not use them, but I'm just saying that like it's not a production ready thing that it's not possible to put in production for my startup, for example.
yeah. All good. I think we are on the same page here. So let's talk about a little bit about how, like, what problems come up when you want to put MCPs to production. Because in an online course, usually everything is like nice and shiny. But can you talk a little bit about the caveats and the failure modes that you wouldn't expect an online course, like a standard online course, warn people about when developing MCPs?
So the deployment, I think, and the hosting is fairly new in the environment of MCP. Like the standard way of developing MCP for, let's say, 6 months after launch of MCP was just to push something on GitHub, and or maybe like if you are using Python, would be push on PyPy as well, so people can quickly install them with UVX or with a similar pip commands, or like on as an npm package so that they can do npx as well. But this was like more like the standard way of sort of deploying MCP servers. But nowadays, I think it's going more and more toward like hosting MCP server, and in particular, if you're a company or if you want to run like MCPs in productions, you don't want people to start having to, have the right dependencies installed on their side, having UV installed or having npm installed, or this kind of things.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's where it's going toward. And for that, like there are a few now companies that are starting to provide some easy way of hosting MCP servers. So I've seen some of them, which makes the whole thing easier. But otherwise, so like if you don't use those providers, then it's still quite tricky, I think, to host reliably MCP servers for your customers at scale, at least. So if you remain in small scale, I don't think you would have much issue. So having an MCP server working in with SSE is not that complicated. Still, I think one of the big challenges that there was authentication, and now it's starting to become more and more solved. There are examples, for example, on the Python SDK now that shows a bit how it works. I don't know if you've already the class, but authentication is usually quite essential for an MCP server in production, because most of the tools that you want to use, they have some kind of connection with either like the person, and the permission you want to give are always like more or less dependent on the user. So they would never things. So that's kind of like also one of the things tricky, but that will become, I think, less tricky in the future. And yes, and then if you want to scale it, I think, it becomes tricky as soon as you want to start to like distribute it over maybe a cluster of machines or this kind of things, because of the stateful nature,
Yeah.
also the stateful nature of the MCP server, having like some, like for example, you cannot just put it in the Lambda function and having it run at scale for all of your users, but you would need to maybe have a machine that runs for a longer time to cover like the full extent of the session, because a lot of these MCP servers, they take time to run the tool command and this kind of thing. So
yeah.
So that's a challenge, but I think they are coming more and more easy, and they will simplify in the future for sure. Maybe also like I think one of the questions maybe you will have later, but like around like monitoring as well is interesting.
Yeah. Okay, let me reflect to your answer first. It's yeah, definitely. I think authentication is at the moment tricky. I'm saying it from a point of view that I need to explain it to people, and it's like that's I think the most sophisticated piece of the course at the moment to set up authentication. But fortunately, of course, it works. And what you just said is that basically the challenge is like most of the challenges that we have with MCPs is very similar to the challenges that we have with any stateful web services.
Yes.
Like scalability and maintaining state and ensuring that the client always is the.
Yes, but the difference is that stateful issues and like with web servers were like something so common that like we grew into a lot of solutions today that we have for those. But so it's very new, so there is not like so much like hands-on as you would get for, or like you are not helped as much as you would get for like developing a web server. Or...
Yeah. Okay, and what if we go to the client side? So even if I'm a Claude user, or if I use, for example, MCPAdapt or any framework, and I want to integrate, like I come up with a use case to, let's say, I want to build my personal assistant, and I'm just gluing in my Gmail and to-do list and calendar and Notion and whatever, and I end up with like 20 MCPs connected to my client. What challenges do you see there?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are some like obvious challenges that I've already seen is like in a lot of the MCP client implementation, there was like some, like even name conflicts between the tools, like if you name the tool the same in the different MCP servers, then you can have the issue that the name clash, and then you don't know which tool is going to be invoked for a given name. So like that's one of the obvious, I guess, challenges you could get. Apart from that, I think as the number of tools start to scale, I think the LLMs itself try to struggle, and this really depends on the LLM that you are using on the client side. So I think with Claude, you can probably like Claude being one of the best probably at tool usage today, you can still like manage with quite a few tools, but maybe some like maybe it gets to a lower limits if you go with open source LLMs. This I must say I don't have like so much experience myself with, but it seems to be like that Claude is a bit like the winner on tool usage, and that it would scale better. So and that's where like starting simple is always good. So like start with only a few tools and then start to increase them so that you can see a bit like where is the limit on this. Is important because at some point I imagine the LLM just gets confused about what to use, not to use, and start to just making calls a bit randomly. So also, I guess at the point if you start to have like thousands of tools on your LLM, like even just asking a simple questions where you might not expect that tool would be used, will still trigger some kind of tool usage that you were not expecting. So
okay,
that's kind of yeah. I mean, if you have a few tools, it's still quite easy to have, this mapping in your head as I will ask this question, it's going to use this tool. I know, but as soon as you start to add a lot of different tools, it becomes a bit more complicated.
Yeah, I can imagine. And how would you go about it if even again either Claude or client framework, if you have a bunch of MCP integrations and you want to debug, like something goes wrong and you want to debug it, how would you monitor or like go with that?
Yeah, at the moment, I don't know if there is some great monitoring solution. Early on the MCP protocol, my early works were also like trying to monitor what's going on, and I've actually also another open source project which is quite small. I think it's called Open MCP Proxy. And if I remember well, it was like almost 6 months old, or maybe right now. But so the idea was that this MCP proxy would sit in between the client and the server, and would basically like be able to listen what are all the client calls that comes in and what are their answers from the MCP server. In one of the solutions I built at some point, I used that as a way to log all of the different calls, and especially if there are errors, and I would use I quite like the Logfire. I don't know if you know, of the Pydantic team, they have a monitoring tool that they created. It's called Logfire, but you could use any log system that you want there to basically, be able to monitor a bit like what's going on between the MCP client and MCP server in production. I found it quite useful to do that. But otherwise, that's probably how I would go about it, I guess, now, if I had to, because that's what I did at the time. But yeah.
And if you work with you try an MCP in Cloud, for example,
Yes.
then you have the Cloud logs, right? Like the
Yes.
MCP specific logs and the standard logs. What do you use any other tools for just taking a look at what's going on? When
Oh yeah, so something that I really love about so as a tool to monitor a specific MCP server, right? So not like so not directly the usage of MCP client and MCP server, but the MCP protocol inspector is really great for like monitoring and checking that your MCP server is doing what you want it to do. But it's only for individual MCP server, I guess. I'm not sure, or at least I've never used it in the context of several MCP server connected to the MCP inspector. I think this is quite great. And then in terms of logs and monitoring, I mean, for me, there is always one part of the picture that's a bit missing, but it's also by design, is that, like by monitoring, for example, MCP client and MCP server communications, you are missing a bit the picture of all what happens in the host on the LLM and the LLM calls, and like what did for example, why did it call this tool, or this kind of thing. This you don't get, which can also be sometimes important to understand a bit like why your MCP client or MCP server is failing. But that, I think it's quite tricky, because by design they of course don't want the MCP protocol to be having the conversation that's going on. On the person.
Sure. Okay, thank you. That's very useful. So just a few more questions, maybe about again, like putting MCPs to production in the future of MCPs. Where do you see now this whole MCP space going at the time of June 2025?
Yeah, so I think it's I see it as growing quite quickly. There was a few announcements from Google, OpenAI from already a while that were saying like, this would be integrated into their stack. We are seeing it right now, like being integrated mostly on the API side of their stack. So like if you look at now, I think like last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, Google, they announced that it would be integrated into their API. So like now you can make API call with MCP. Also like similar things happened with OpenAI. And there is also like rumors that this would be integrated in ChatGPT. So this I don't know, but looks like it's also something that can happen. And it was also announced by Sam Altman that it would happen. So I think like MCP is like probably going to be even more prominent in the future and usable in more places. Also, like in terms of immediate feature development on the MCP protocol itself. So this is a bit like what we discussed. So authentication is kind of the new thing. Streamable HTTP, so a bit of a change on how remote MCP works. I expect to have more work on this part, like because this is how you can actually spread the adoption. To have good, reliable authentication and MCP servers developed to work remotely. I think this is how you can go further with MCP, basically.
So maybe like I can see, and obviously you're a believer in MCPs, and I'm a believer in MCP too. But what's your brutally honest assessment? Like, what part of MCPs you think is just a hype, and where is this whole hype going around MCPs justified?
Yeah.
So where would you be skeptical?
Interesting question. I think there is definitely a hype, right? I'm not blind to that. I think really like so part of it is overhyped as well. You know, thinking that you can do everything with MCP as well is probably a bit too much, but I think it has still some positive. It brings some positive things, even if it's hyped, you know, because it forced, I think, people that, and even like API developers, to rethink a bit their API for LLM consumption, and it forced a bit everybody to start to rethink a bit of how, you know, like their application or their API can be consumed by LLMs, and maybe it could have been through API, but then you would need to, you know, think about good descriptions for the LLM to be calling the API in the right way, you know, this kind of thing. So it's really, I think, forced people to work on that problem, and you see the results, right? Like thousands of MCP servers are now on GitHub, so you can really like plug and play a lot of those. So I think that's for me, like I'm more focusing on the result you bring than on the, you know, on the hype it created, because the hype has like such a, I think, a positive impact in the end, even though it doesn't solve all the challenges, of course. But
yeah, makes sense. So let me just think. I still wanted to ask you about your advice to students who are now very much seasoned at this point of the course with MCP, so they got their feet wet, and they might want to implement their own MCP. So what would be your suggestion on what are maybe the blind spots? What are the most important aspects to cover if they want to come up with a minimum viable architecture that they can already put into production?
yeah. So I mean, like, we'll always say that, but like start simple. I would first like, and that's also how I work today, like start with a very quick, fast MCP implementation of the MCP. Just a few tools at the beginning, the minimum I can do. Then I would probably try them with the inspector. As I said before, I think the inspector is really great. Like, you can really quickly see just calling the tools if it's working or if it's not working, you know. And probably I would also start mostly with tools, as I said before, like, because most of the cloud support tools, and maybe then expand, you know, try. So, okay, this was a tool before, but maybe it could be sort of like changed or refactored into a resource later, you know.
Yeah.
But I would like keep that simple in that sense. And then maybe, so when it comes to deployments, we've been working with the startup a lot on Google Cloud. So these days I'm thinking like having and Google Cloud runs, they support streamable and streaming right now. So what you could do is you could start like to have like this as a, even as a not too expensive way to distribute to your users, like as a streamable HTTP solution on top of Google Cloud.
Yeah.
It could work quite well from my early tests. So it's not production ready yet, but that's where I'm thinking to go for myself as well. So
that would be the place where you would like try to put it into.
I'm thinking of it, yeah, strongly. Strongly thinking of this. I think that's where I will go in the end, because it looks like a right fit. Like Google Cloud Run makes it quite simple to have like Docker based solution running as some sort of endpoints.
Yeah.
In the end, it's just like a web application, but it runs as a serverless application. And I think just having the MCP defined and maybe in a Docker container can. I think it would work. So I've tested already the part up to like SSE streaming, and it was working fine. So I don't see why it would not work. Also the MCP part as well. But I'm revealing all my tricks now.
All right. Yeah. Before you give away all of your business secrets, I think we can wrap it. So Guillaume, thanks so much for this discussion. I believe this was like super useful, and it will, our students will benefit a lot from that. And I'm wishing you all the best in your work advancing the field of AI.
Thank you, Dan. It was really a pleasure.